For those of you who don't know me, I'm Mary Beth Rawson, the Associate Dean here, and the happy coordinator of our most prestigious teaching award that we give out every year. Unfortunately, the donors behind this award, George McMurtry and his wife, are not able to make it here. They usually come and love to hear these celebratory lectures that we give. But nonetheless, we're going to have a fantastic meeting today with this year's award winner, my buddy, my mini-me, David Fusco, who, it's hard to believe that you only joined us, what, 5 years ago?
Yes.
5 years
Yes.
ago. Because it seems like you've been here forever. You know, it really does. You just
I guess that's a good thing.
You fit in so well, and you've found so many ways to contribute to the college, most recently as the director of the graduate master's programs. So I have yet another connection with David now. But this is to celebrate his teaching accomplishments. And I think that if you know David's history, you'll know something about why he's so successful in the classroom. And he is, we could say, a jack of many trades. I wasn't going to say all trades, but he has done so much in his life prior to coming here that he has oodles and oodles. That's a real word, right? Oodle? Oodles and oodles of real world experience in the arena of technology being used for all kinds of purposes in the world, both from, you know, kind of a more entrepreneurship and company perspective, but also in other academic environments like at Juniata. So, you know, we were so excited when he joined us, and he has more than fulfilled all our expectations. He teaches mostly in the advanced integration area, but this year, for the first time, he's teaching one of his loves, which is introductory programming. So, you know, we're gonna use him wherever we can because he brings such a passion for teaching to whatever he teaches. So, with that, he's going to talk to us. Oh, wait. Let me do this. This is the official awarding of the award. This is for you.
Oh, wow.
There's more too. There's like an inscription and all of that, but this, look at that.
Oh, wow.
Whoa.
Yay.
It says, David Fusco, George McMurtry Excellence in Teaching and Learning Award 2017-18. So, is that cool? We'll take
That's
a picture
very
later.
cool.
We'll
Okay.
take a picture
Very
later.
good. Well, thank you. Thank you
All
very
right,
much.
So, with no further ado, educating the next generation of leaders who happen to use technology. David, take it away.
Thank you. Well, thank you, Mary Beth, and thanks everybody for coming today. And you know, it's as Ed glanced come in and said, okay, we have high expectations of you, and a couple others have said that to me. So the bar is really high. And I also kind of just to start off with, I ran into Randy this morning, and he gave me some really good advice. And he said, first he said, good luck with everything. And he said, by the way, if anything goes wrong or if anything breaks, just blame it on John Hill. So, so that's, I said to Randy, so I'm gonna quote you on that, Randy. I'm gonna use that today. So, well, it's interesting as you kind of think about, you know, kind of the passion for teaching that we all have and kind of this topic. And I thought a lot about the kinds of things that I wanted to talk about here today. And I think the first thing I wanted to recognize, again, as Mary Beth said, is Dr. McMurtry, who unfortunately can't be with us today. But I know you're watching this later at your convenience, Dr. McMurtry. So we really appreciate all the things you've done for us, including the founding work in the College of IST so many years ago. So thanks for that as well. I just thought I would start off with this in kind of thinking, I tend to reflect a lot. It's kind of a blessing and a curse on as you kind of think about different things. And I tend to think that people tend to parent like they were parented. They tend to coach like they were coached, and they tend to teach like they were taught. And I tend to reflect on that about kind of how I was taught as a student my whole life. And I tend to kind of wrap that into my own teaching atmosphere. this is something that I think kind of sets the tone for me. If you're familiar with Thomas Friedman and the writing that he has, he said something here about 4 years ago, and he said that average is over. And I kind of read that, and it resonated with me really well, that one of the jobs that we have as faculty in IST is to help students recognize that one of the things that technology has done is really globalize all of us, right? And the fact that this idea that average is over for us, that we have to help people recognize those things. Many of you may not know what this is. Some of you might know what it is, but I thought I would start off with a story of how a teacher influenced my life a long time ago. And those of you who don't know what this is, it's a flowcharting template tool. This was given to me in my first programming class back in high school, and it actually has followed me to this day at every job I've had. I put it in my top desk drawer, and it's kind of a routine for me now, and it's a memento of things that I've learned. And the story goes like this. It was my first programming class, and the teacher had this rule that said, if you raise your hand and you have any questions, I'm happy to come and help you with your code, but I need to see your flowchart first. I'm not going to help you at all until I see your logic and I see what your thinking process was. And that always stuck with me, that he didn't just give me the answer. He wanted to see exactly what my mind was thinking before he would help me. And that's one of those things you kind of think that sometimes you say things to people and they kind of stick with them for life. And I just want to say thank you, Mr. Brandt, for being that person who kind of challenged me to become better. You know, I couldn't be here, right, without learning from others. And you'll see some of them in the room here, right? Others who have won this award. And you kind of see that teaching excellence in IST is really kind of a group effort, right? We all support each other. And I also would want to give some recognition to a friend of mine, Bill Harshman, who is a former ag teacher here at Penn State. And on runs that he and others we have, he kind of gives me brutal honesty. And I think you need to have that kind of a person in your life too, right? Somebody who doesn't just sugarcoat things, but somebody who can give you some real honest feedback on the kinds of things that you're thinking about, which I think is really important. Just to kind of give you some background, those of you who don't know me, I'm from Altoona originally, which is fairly local here, right? And I was the student who did not take the traditional academic path. I went to what was called VOTEC, and lots of friends of mine said, why are you going to VOTEC? You should be in the academic path. And I ended up going to VOTEC for 3 years of programming, and I never looked back. I loved it, and it was something that really kind of stayed with me. After that, I went to Penn State here for computer science, which gives me perspective of, you know, when I make reference to Cafe 210, I know what these places are, and the students I can kind of relate to the Penn State student from that perspective as well. Also giving me lots of perspective are my 3 daughters, for good and bad. They are 23, 19, and 17, and my 19-year-old is now a freshman at Penn State, and I'll talk to her about things, and I'll say, well, I'm going to try this in class, and she'll say, what? Don't do that. That's stupid. I don't like when professors do that. So again, brutal honesty. She'll kind of tell me that things are not a good idea, and I'll also kind of hear from them about the tech side of things. You know, I'm constantly trying to keep up with what's happening, and I think that's really important for us, right? We try to kind of understand from the perspective of, you know, a 19 or a 20-year-old, and they give that to me. So that's really good for me. Kind of this wouldn't be a faculty talk if I didn't have a little bit of foundational research in it, right? And so what I kind of want to just share with you that this was something that I found in my doctoral studies, and this is a model that really focuses on this combination of technology, pedagogy, and content knowledge. And it's really trying to find that perfect blend of being a good teacher while kind of mixing all this stuff together, right? And we're kind of, as professors in IST, we're kind of expected to have this uber knowledge of IT, and sometimes, you know, there's certain things we don't know, but we try to find this balance of all these different kinds of things. So let me tell you a little bit about my first class experience. The first class that I was asked to teach was right after I graduated Penn State, and a local community college asked me to teach this C++ course. This is what I envision it to be like. Everybody learning and calm. And what ended up being was mass chaos. I blew through all my material in like 20 minutes, and I went home vowing never to teach again. I thought, I'm never going to do this ever again. I hated it so much. And I got home and I said, no, I got to get back on the horse. I can't just ignore this thing. And I ended up really loving it and figuring out that I learned from my mistakes and knowing that you need to have more than just 20 minutes worth of material to talk about with students. It ended up being a good thing for me. So as Mary Beth kind of said, I'm very fortunate in that the students that I get to teach now are mainly seniors. Although I've taught teaching a freshman course this semester with Rosalie and and others, and that gives me good perspective too, because I haven't taught freshmen in a while, and that opened my eyes up to some things of, again, bringing perspective to me. But I'm fortunate in that most of my students are kind of on their way out the door from Penn State, and for me, one of the best things I enjoy about my job is helping students make decisions about life decisions and things they're trying to decide between a couple jobs, and again, giving me perspective on where they move in, why they moving, what kind of jobs are they taking, and so I've really kind of found myself really enjoying these types of courses for me. So if you kind of go to the kind of student that I believe we should graduate, and please note that there's an asterisk there on that slide, because there's today I get to kind of say what I think should happen, but you may not agree with what I say today, and by all means, you are welcome to have that opinion against me. But I think that the kind of student that we should graduate should really have a combination of deeper technical knowledge, understanding organizations, and their business behavior from that perspective, and then kind of creating this holistic person. And I know that sounds kind of cliche, but it really is kind of the underpinning of what everything that I do is, this idea of creating this holistic person to be able to kind of understand these softer leadership type skills. So I thought I would play this. And this is a video that I played in one of my classes. And you'll see why later, that I try to make things relatable for students. And you'll kind of see that this is, again, a blessing and a curse. I'll watch a movie, and then I'm like instantly converting it into how I can talk about it in class. And I know I see those of you that teach kind of shaking your heads, and you're like, oh yeah, I can make this relatable. And so this is what leading in IT really is like.
Oh no! I'm lost! Where's the line? It just went away. What do I do? Help! We'll be stuck here forever.
Do not panic! Do not panic! We are trained professionals. Now stay calm. We are going around the leaf.
Around the leaf? I don't think we can do that.
Oh, nonsense. This is nothing compared to the twig of 93. That's it. That's it. Good. You're doing great. There you go. There you go. Watch my eyes. Don't look away. And here's the line again.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Soil.
Good job, everybody.
And so it's kind of like I'll talk with students about Lionpath, and I'm like, okay, here comes Lionpath, and there's people that are like, what do you mean? We've been doing it this way for the last 20 years, and we can't do it. And I try to help students understand that you're the person getting them around the leaf, that they've been carrying little pieces of fruit the same way for 20 years, and now all of a sudden we have to carry our fruit differently. And we find that in IT a lot, it's change management and really kind of helping people understand these kinds of things. And I think it's funny, every time I bring up a movie with students, I have to refresh myself that the students may never have seen this movie. I did that with The Matrix a couple years ago, and they were like, well, I never heard of The Matrix. You kind of have to remember that sometimes you bring a movie reference in, and it's not quite the same. So here's something that I thought I would share with you, and some of my students are in class when I kind of brought this up to them. And this is one of those things you may or may not agree with, but I kind of drew this on the board one class, and it's what I call this continuum model, okay? And the idea behind this continuum model is that I cleaned it up for you because this is like my chicken scratch, and I'm not good at writing neatly. But so I kind of converted this into this interactive slide rule here. And basically what it says is, drag the slider to display the current value of tech stack knowledge and drag the slider for your current value of soft skills and critical thinking. And the values go from 0 to 50 on each one, and the total is 100. But what I ended up kind of helping students understand is, because what I hear from students is they'll say, well, I went on an internship and I came back and I feel like I just don't have the technical knowledge that maybe some of the people that I worked with have. Or it might be the opposite. They might say, I'm really strong technically, but I can't seem to figure out how to communicate well with people or kind of find this perfect balance. And what I try to help students understand is if you're going to be less on one of them, right, then you better make it up in the other one. So if you're not very good technically, then you need to be really great at having some good communication skills, and vice versa. Now, ideally, it'd be great to have both be really high, but you might find that you can have a student who isn't necessarily technically strong, but is really great working with people. And so I try to help students say, well, you can't be low in both of them, right? You can't not have technical knowledge, and you can't be the person that nobody wants to work with in your team, right? You can't have both. You got to fix that before you leave here, right? You got to figure out how we can do that. And so I try to help students find a balance between those two kinds of things. So this is, I kind of thought about this. Maybe this is a little dangerous to kind of put this up here, but this is kind of where I think we're at right now. If you kind of took the average IST student, I think this is the score I would give us, okay? Again, this is just kind of my opinion of this, and you could kind of take it up or down. And where I think we need to go is more like this, right? I kind of say, this is where I think we need to help students kind of get to, right? And this isn't like I have this continuum and I apply it to curriculum or any of those kinds of things. This is kind of the thing that's in the back of my mind consistently, right? It's a way for me to say, where are people at right now? Where are students at? And understanding where they might fall. And we also discuss what are some influencers on this continuum, right? We talk about differences of gender and race and other kinds of things that impact or might influence this particular continuum model, and where a student might fall along this continuum, right? And recognizing that those things are important to discuss. And so if we start to kind of look at what are some of the books that I have my students read, and some of the students that are sitting here today are in this class. And you might think to yourself, sometimes people say, why are you having them read these books, right? Isn't this an IST program? Why are we having them read these books, right? This is one class that I have them recognize kind of these deeper critical thinking kinds of skills. And then I have other classes that are much more technical in nature. But for this particular class, some of you might have seen these books before. My favorite of all of these is A Whole New Mind from Daniel Pink. And if you've kind of followed Daniel Pink over the years, basically what he says is that the next generation of technology type people are going to be those people that are creative as well as technical, which kind of sounds just like that continuum model that I had up here just a few slides ago, right? The other ones are kind of more books that you might see in a business type program, obviously good to great, but I try to help students kind of recognize the value of what leadership is going to look like, right, into the future. The first class that I have every semester, and I'm not the only person who does this. I know Jerry Santoro was kind of very open about these kinds of things. And the idea is to help students recognize that we are real people, that professors are real people, and that we do actually hang out and do things on the weekend. We don't go home and just read all weekend, right? We do other kinds of things. And I think I try to kind of laugh at myself, right? And try to help them understand that, I have a family. And I think that's important that first day, that you help students recognize the value of seeing the kinds of things from a personal standpoint. So kind of looking at some different teaching methods that I use, right? One is I try to use real life examples a lot. I try very hard not to do the back in the 90s kind of conversations, because I think, you have to recognize that some of them weren't born when you're talking about some of these things. But I try to give them real examples that relate to them from maybe the experiences that they have had. One of the things we just did in a class last week was a role-playing exercise. I put a table up at the front of the room, and I had one person was the boss, and the other person was the employee, and I gave them little slips of paper, and they had to pretend that they were carrying out these things. What are the things they had to do? They had to fire somebody. They had to fire their friend. They had to confront somebody that had something inappropriate on their computer. They had to do all different kinds of scenarios, and they stepped through what it was like to kind of be one of these people. Because I think we do a fairly good job at recognizing you're going to be a manager when you leave IST, right? We kind of tell students this. And I try to kind of take a moment to say, well, it's not just having this title, it's actually doing these things. You're going to have to probably, fire somebody at some point. It's not the most fun thing to do, right? In the classroom, I try to tell stories a lot. And again, this is nothing that, I'm sure lots of people tell stories, but instead of kind of just putting the information out there, I try to tell it through the lens of a story, right? Making it relatable. I use Lionpath quite a bit for a bunch of reasons. It's almost kind of a case study in and of itself, but I use Lionpath because for this particular generation that I have right now, I have the advantage of them knowing the before Lionpath. Another year or two, I'm not going to be able to use this example anymore, right? So I can use these relatable kinds of subjects of saying, well, you kind of remember the way it used to be, and you remember kind of change management. So I make it relatable that way. I have them talk about their internships, right? I have them reflect on those things that relate to their life experiences in that regard. I use their roommates or their friends a lot. I try to say, if you had a conflict negotiation with your roommate, what would it look like, kind of thing. So I try to make these things relatable to them. The other kind of teaching approach that I take is this idea of let them swim. My students may not appreciate that right off the bat. And what I mean by that is I kind of get them into the deep end pretty quickly, and I kind of see what they can do with it, right? I tend to think that our students, the best of them, and that they can learn how to swim. So I'm not necessarily prescriptive in saying do this, this, and this, and this, right? I might have a life raft or a preserver that I'll throw to them once in a while, but for the most part, again, because I'm teaching seniors, I kind of push them in the deep end and see what they produce, right? Just some examples here, again, kind of sharing some things that I've done and do. In IST 420, I have them, instead of handing them a case study exactly, I give them some very basic shells of, here's how this particular company like Airbnb or Kellogg's is using an Amazon AWS type product. And I have them understand what are the inner workings of those kinds of things. So instead of making it prescriptive, I kind of say, here's the scenario, let's see what you can come up with. And students can come up with some really awesome things. We're not going to expect you to read these kinds of things, but I put these up here as just an example of the kinds of things that students produce with, I wouldn't say very little direction, but the idea that I give them a scenario that they have to solve, and they come up with solutions on their own without having to say, do this first, and then that first, and then that first. So much more kind of open-ended. Those of you who know me, I like to use blogs a lot in my courses, particularly in graduate courses. I think blogs are really important. I use them in undergraduate courses as well. And some people have some different perspectives on these things. This isn't for me, right? Blogging isn't for me. It's for them. It's a self-reflection process that they can go through the idea of the course material, and you can kind of see the kinds of things that they write. And I don't grade these based on their content. I grade them more based on their reflection capabilities. I know that the back of the room you can't necessarily see this one, and I apologize, the lens is a little dark. But it's kind of this reflection idea. And again, I don't ask them to write a lot, but I ask them on a week-by-week basis, I want you to reflect on the kinds of things you've learned this week, right? And again, it's not, I think what happens with students when you kind of give them these open-ended kinds of assignments, they've been taught for a really long time to do things very much like we've asked them to do, very specific, right? And when you give them kind of these open-ended things, they're like, the first thing they ask is, well, how many words does this have to be? Don't worry about that. I want you to just write some this week. Write a paragraph or two. What do you mean, 2 paragraphs or 1 paragraph? Just figure it out. You can figure it out. It's okay, right? And again, I tend to kind of have them reflect on those kinds of things. Do unplanned activities, right? Do things that you might, some days I'll be driving to work and I'll say, I think we're going to try this, right? And again, don't be afraid to know that students are welcoming to kind of trying new things, right? You can kind of do things on the fly. And this is something I did last spring. And students kind of jumped right into it and took to it right away. And we did some new technologies with some cloud services back in the spring. One of the other things that I tend to do a lot is have an open office. Now, everybody kind of can say that, right? And that's good. Everybody can kind of say that. And I would tell you that most of the students who come to my office aren't asking me questions about courses. They're usually coming in and saying, hey, I got 3 offers. What should I do? I mean, and that happens more time than you might think, right? Or I'm trying to figure out, you know, I already accepted this offer, and I got this interview with Microsoft, and I really would love to work at Microsoft. And they come to me, and they're like, I just don't know how to tell the first person how to turn them down. So we talk about those kinds of things. And again, probably one of the more rewarding kinds of parts to my job. So how do we know this stuff's working, right? How do I get some kind of a validation that, you know, am I just crazy and doing these things, and am I just hoping that students are going to kind of take to these kinds of things? One of the things that Nitya shared with me, who's sitting here with us, her and her team took first place in the Hack PSU Challenge here about a month or so ago. They took 2 first places, right? Both with Nittany AI and the Google Challenge. And she came in to tell me she was really proud, and I was really proud of her and her team. And I said, hey, if you don't mind, could you send me the criteria that Google used to judge you? I'm really curious to see these. And I kind of like cross my fingers that what I'm going to get is going to support the things that I believe in and the things that I do. And then she sent me this, and I was like, yeah, good. Creativity, like the first thing out of the gate, right? Being able to be creative, you know, and you can kind of read down through these, but they're validators of the kinds of things that we ask our students to do. I shared this one. You can kind of see it in the lower right-hand corner. I was at an EDUCAUSE conference here a couple weeks ago. And if you're not familiar with EDUCAUSE, it's a international organization that represents higher ed and technology. And all they talk about is technology and higher ed and different kinds of planning and strategy and all those kinds of things. And I got there, and this was the Take a Deeper Dive wall of books, okay? Now, and this is, again, the kinds of things that I think about, right? I walk up to this wall, and before I walked up to the wall, I kind of think to myself, I wonder what the books are that the top IT minds in higher education are reading, okay? So I'm like, kind of cleanse my mind to think, okay, what am I going to see here? And what I saw was a lot around inclusion and diversity and women at work, overcoming bias, right? And you kind of walk away from that and you think, at least I did, I was like, I need to share this with my students, right? That technology is important because that's what we do, but the bigger message, right? The world that they're entering has a lot more important social kinds of problems that we need to solve. And I wanted to share this with them, and I said, these are the kinds of things. You need to understand technology, absolutely, but then you need to have context. And I think that's what IST is really all about, right? So I shared this with them so that they can understand that. Industry partners, they come back pretty frequently. I talk with Zoe a lot. I talk with different kinds of industry partners that come in, and I hear from them. Every time we have the Pro Expo, I tend to walk around, and I'm like, all right, I go and like, they think I'm interviewing. I'm like, no, I don't want to interview. Just tell me what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? And I hear a lot of the times that we're doing it right. Industry partners come back and they're like, we really like what you're doing. Keep doing it and keep improving the kinds of things that you're doing. So that helps. Some of the things that I do in my research time, I work on learner-focused tools and helping learners help themselves. I'm really kind of about developing tools and software around students to help themselves. And so this year I was fortunate enough to present with IEEE and Educause here, like I said, just a few weeks ago. So that's really cool. What a cool job, right? You get to be able to kind of do the things that you're passionate about, even in your research as well. So why this makes this the best job, right? And I'm sure I'm not the only person in the room that gets these, right? You kind of wait, you get the mail upstairs, which I check like once a month because, you know, it's like mail. Who gets mail anymore, right? But every once in a while, I'll go to the mailbox and there'll be this thank you card in the mail, and it's a note from a former student, and they thank you for something that you did for them, and that right there is what makes it all worthwhile and helps reaffirm the kinds of things that we do. So teach like you were taught, but don't forget to pay it forward. And that is my talks, and so thank you. Cindy told me to keep it to a half an hour, and I wanted to be really close to Cindy's instructions.
Plenty of time to fill in the space with questions. Mark.
Just real quick, this is a very specific question. So what did you do with Docker in your class when you said you had this idea in the car to go in and do something with the...
So his question, I'll repeat the question. He said, what did I do with Docker? And for us kind of nerds in the audience, I wanted to help them understand the differences between kind of how you can build a server from scratch to doing something in the cloud to spinning up microservices. And again, I try to give them that perspective. I try not to dwell on the whole, this is how we used to build servers, right? But at the same time, I think it's important for us to recognize that there's a lot of legacy stuff out there that they're going to walk into. This isn't all brand new mobile cloud first kinds of stuff, right? But to help them kind of see the difference of that perspective. Did I answer your question? Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Other questions?
Teach like you were taught. The apprenticeship of observation has a lot of value. You've learned from other experts, but how do you balance that like inertia of like doing the same thing versus like trying to be creative and trying to do things that are more innovative?
Yeah, I think, you know, what I hear from other people who teach, particularly using technology, is they'll say, I don't want to look like a fool in front of students, right? I don't want to try that. Like, I played that video, right? Like, that thing could have bombed, right? People will say, I don't want to try technology. That could impact my SRTE, or I don't. And what I've found is that students are pretty forgiving. I think you kind of tell them up front and say, look, I'm going to try this. I'm going to try this Docker thing today. I'm going to try this today. Most of the time, if you're kind of up front to begin with, I would say students are pretty receptive to those kinds of things. Again, just kind of being open with that. And again, most of the time, you know, like I'll talk to a friend of mine and I'll say, well, I tried what you told me to do and it just didn't work. Not everybody has the same style either in teaching. What might work for one person doesn't work for maybe the next person. Yeah.
Hi, Dave.
Hey, Amy.
Could you talk a bit about how your professional career, which you've had, I won't say on the side, but you know, you've had professional career as well.
Yeah.
How that has helped shape your teaching style and approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, think for me, I was at a smaller institution for about 16 years. And in that role, I worked with students a lot. And it was a smaller environment, and I ended up having to wear a lot of hats in that role. And what I ended up finding out was I got to connect with students a lot closer in that role than maybe I would have in other kinds of roles. And I ended up really kind of trying to understand, and I got to know the kinds of things that they want out of an instructor and the kinds of things that they're looking for out of getting a college degree. And again, everybody's kind of different, but you kind of walk into the classroom knowing that everybody has different expectations. But I think for me, it was, I think for me at the end of the day, I don't know if you ever heard what CIO stands for. Some say it stands for career is over. But in this role, I'd go home a lot of days, and what I found driving home was that the brightest spots of my days were students. That the time that I was able to spend with students, and I was able to help them achieve some things. And that, for me, translated into, I think, for me, the classroom. You're going to get, don't trip on that.
I get steps.
This room is like, if you've ever noticed, we have this hazard tape. So, yes.
Hi, Dave.
Hey, Jason.
I really like your continuum. And so I like those two of the technical and the communication. But given what you saw at EduCalls, do you think a third continuum might be sort of this social-political reality and inclusivity, understanding that that continuum is sort of like an emerging third place for our students, that they need to be competent along with those first two?
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. And for those, again, I'll repeat these for the video. Jason's observation is maybe a third, which is more of a social awareness, political awareness for our students. And I think what I find with students, and even some of us, right, is that their social media and their social awareness comes from what I'd call like-mindedness, right? People that they're connected to, typically, I don't want to say it's a bubble, but it's really kind of this circle, right? And what I tend to challenge students to do is to kind of get in touch with maybe people that aren't necessarily like-minded, right? To kind of open and branch out of what's typically your circle. I even ask my daughters this. I'm like, well, who do you typically, follow on a particular social media? And it's the same kind of thing. And I'm always trying to be the person that says, well, maybe you ought to maybe look at somebody else or read something else, or kind of break out of that. And I don't know. We could ask our students that, but I think having a social awareness is absolutely important.
Other questions? I think that some of the students.
Yeah, forget that rate my professor stuff. You can just say it right here now. Just
Ask him just something off the merit.
oh boy.
I'll let you think about it. Okay, here we go. A brave guy.
So firstly, I'd like to say thank you for the lecture. So my question, so me personally, I served as a technology director for Penn State Homecoming this past year, and currently I'm in a position in which I'm transitioning my duties off to my successor. So what pieces of advice would you give for someone leaving a role and bringing it on to a new person?
Wow, very good question, right? The question is, how do you pass on your knowledges and your experiences to the next person who's going to take over for you? And I would say the first thing you do is force yourself to remember what it was like when you first started into that role. Because what happens is people that pass things along, they get pretty systemic about things. They're like, it might be, we got to log into this system and approve these things for homecoming and do this, this, and this. And you kind of have to stop yourself for a second and say, hold on a second. Make it relevant and put context around it. We're going to have to do this because in the past we've had problems with these three things. And there's this department that's always a problem, but just so you know, if you're really nice to them early enough, it doesn't tend to be a problem. So don't assume that they know the kinds of things that maybe you now know, right? Kind of take yourself back to that first time when you first had to learn it and make it relevant for them.
Dave, thanks again for your talk. It's great to hear your perspective. I love your phrase, teach like you were taught, and I think that's important. I tend to look to my mentors and the people that taught me. But I also find more recently, being a newer instructor, I learn a ton from my students as well, that they're also my teachers. Can you talk about any lessons you've learned from your students, especially seeing that they kind of grew up in a different generation than some of us did without as much technology?
Well, yeah, that is definitely important. And the question is how have we learned from our students as much as our peers? And I think, again, for me, it's trying to understand the kinds of challenges that they have, and I'll kind of turn the questions back on them, you know, frequently. Like they'll say, well, I'm trying to decide between these two jobs, and I'll say, well, what's in your mind? What are you thinking? Like, is it money? Is it not money? And one specific example, again, I'll go into professor mode, right? But the one thing that we talk about is intrinsic versus extrinsic motivators, and we talk about that in class. And I'll just kind of open up the room to 70 people, and I'll say, okay, what motivates all of you, right? Is it intrinsic or extrinsic? And we talk about the differences between those things. And I try to like not have it in my mind what I think they're going to say, but I'm already like thinking, I know what they're going to say. And then they come back and they say something completely different. And I leave there thinking, oh, I'm glad I asked that. So I kind of tend, you ever hear that idea, you know, if you're a lawyer, don't ever ask the question unless you know what the answer is going to be, right? But I tend to do that frequently. I'll say, okay, let's just see what happens. Let's ask what happens, right? And I do that with students just to kind of see what they think. And I'm actually pretty, you know, amazed at the kind of feedback I get from them. They're pretty open about those kinds of things. So just ask, right? Don't be afraid to ask.
Hi, Dave.
Lisa?
You know, we've worked on assessment a lot. And
Yes.
I think Dave is an awesome assessment professor. He takes it seriously, and he just gets it. And I'm wondering if you could just comment a little bit on anything that very methodical kind of view of reflection on your teaching has done to change anything about what you've done in the classroom.
So her question is, how has assessment really kind of improved my teaching or improved some things in the classroom? And I would say, well, first of all, let me say, and this isn't just because Lisa asked, but we wouldn't be able to do assessment without Lisa, quite frankly. I mean, when you talk to some of the other colleges, they don't have a Lisa, and it's pretty painful for them. So we're really fortunate to have Lisa help us with this. For me, from an assessment standpoint, it breaks down biases that I think that I know what's going on in my class, right? And we see that a lot, right? And I talk to my students about breaking down biases, right? So for me, the assessment is, well, I think students are getting this, and then when you do some assessment, it comes back and you're like, well, I was wrong, right? And then I know that I can adjust, right? Not like shift completely, but it helps me reflect on what I'm doing or trying to do, right? And so for those of you who are kind of like thinking of assessment as filling in forms, it's way more than that. It's about this reflection process for me. Waiting for John to heckle me over here. John. Yeah, that's right. Just by being here, you're heckling me. Yeah, he's just heckling me by.
All right, well, if there are no further questions, join me in thanking.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it. Thank you.